about our democracy, kind of what they learned in fourth grade maybe, or Civics 101. It's not really working out the way we learn it in school. And what's wrong, I guess, with our democracy right now?
Well, we talk a great game about exporting democracy to other nations, but in fact, we've got some real problems here in the United States. The people aren't always in control. Politicians use gerrymandering and other barriers to the ballot to determine who votes and whose vote counts. Voters don't always choose politicians, but too often politicians choose voters by manipulating these voting rules. A whole host of them when we talk about gerrymandering, the barriers, provisional ballots, how do we count them? There's just a whole host of them.
When you talk about that issue of gerrymandering and redistricting, I know one of the facts that you have mentioned before is the attitudes that the public has toward elected officials, bodies, Congress, whatnot, but yet there's very little turnover. Is that a function of this, the way districts are drawn?
Well, you probably know Congress in 2004 had only a 40% approval rating, and yet 98% of incumbents returned to Washington, D.C. Why? Because these districts are drawn in a way that benefits many incumbents. And just to, lay it out, let's just say that I'm a Republican incumbent. I won my last election with only 51% of the vote. And I say that was just too close for comfort. So what I do is we redraw my district to take out some Democratic voters and to add some Republican voters. And the next election I win with 70% of the vote. It's a landslide, and I win not because I'm a better candidate, but because I simply shuffled the voters around. And really, politicians in both parties engage in this behavior. Indeed, in California, both parties were basically in cahoots with one another to protect both Democratic and Republican incumbents. So there's really a problem across the country. And again, it's not about party. It's really about voters and protecting the rights and the interests of voters and elevating those interests of voters as opposed to the interests of politicians.
What can we do? What's the solution?
Right. Well, in light of the Supreme Court's unwillingness to address the problem in the recent Texas gerrymandering case, I think that independent commissions are an important step in the right direction. And the countries around the world that have single-member districts, they use independent commissions to draw districts. There's an inherent conflict of interest they recognize, and incumbents drawing lines for themselves or for their parties, and as a result, they have independent commissions. So I think we need to move toward a system of independent commissions.
If North Carolina goes down that path and we're a Voting Rights Act state, how do we make sure this is a fair system?
Well, I think that from the beginning, we have to ensure that important values are on the table, and values related to including communities of color in terms of both the principles that we use for redistricting, and then also the composition of any commission. We need to figure out and ensure that the commission is diverse, and maybe one way to do that is ensure that we have enough slots, that we don't have commissions that are just made up of 1, 2, or 3 people, but that they're large enough to reflect the diversity of a place like North Carolina. And I think something else that's important is that we have people from diverse backgrounds in North Carolina have a place at the table in the beginning. It's not a situation where we come up with some cookie cutter plan and then try to get buy-in from others after the fact. I think it's important for stakeholders, a diverse group of stakeholders, to be at the table in the very beginning, and it sounds like that's what's happening in North Carolina.
One other question about all this. You mentioned that U.S. Supreme Court case regarding Texas. Is your interpretation that the courts are basically saying that mid-decade redistricting is okay?
I think, unfortunately, the takeaway from that case is that the court does give a green light to mid-decade redistricting. And the problem with that is that we could see political payback in certain states controlled by Democrats. North Carolina is one of them, right? We could also see a situation where Folks feel like, hey, we've had some scandal just before an election. We might lose the state legislature. Let's just redraw the districts in order to maintain power 2 or 3 weeks before an election. I mean, that seems extreme, but the court really didn't put a break on these the bad practices of politicians, and we know politicians, as a matter of self preservation, will engage in particular behavior to maintain power. So I think that the court's opinion really does open the door to some very bad acts.
Okay, quickly, just to three of the topics. I know we dealt on redistricting with some depth, but voter ID, another one of those topics. What's wrong with it?
Right. It really does sound reasonable. It seems like everybody has an ID that's a valid ID. The problem, though, is that there are 20 million people who don't have a photo ID. That's more people than in Delaware, New Mexico, and 14 other states combined. And it hits particular communities pretty hard. For example, in Wisconsin, a study was done, and 23% of senior citizens didn't have a state-issued photo ID. 78% of young black males ages 18 to 24 didn't have a driver's license. So particular communities are excluded, large numbers of people. But then on the other hand, when we look at the other side of the equation, it doesn't seem to be that much fraud. In fact, a study was done in Ohio, and for every 2 million legitimate votes cast, there was only one improper vote found. My concern is that a photo ID would throw the baby out simply because the baby has a drop of bathwater on the baby's arm. We need tools to deal with that bathwater, but we don't want to throw the whole baby out. Some people say, well, we need an ID to get on a plane, therefore it's reasonable and makes sense, but that's apples and oranges. It makes sense to stop 10,000 legitimate flyers from getting on a plane if we can stop one terrorist from blowing up a plane. That absolutely makes sense, but it doesn't make sense to exclude 10,000 legitimate voters in order to stop just one improper voter. And the reason that doesn't make sense is because democracy is about government of, by, and for the people. We want government to reflect the will of the people. So if we're excluding many more legitimate voters than improper voters, then we're moving farther away from the purpose of democracy.
One other issue, same-day voter registration. Is it really too much to ask folks to register arbitrarily 24 or 23 days, I think in North Carolina it is, before Election Day? Why would we want to allow folks to potentially vote the day of the election?
Well, right now, the United States is in the bottom 19% in voter turnout of democracies in the world. One of the reasons is that it's easier to vote in many other areas of the world than it is to vote in the United States. Certainly right now we have the technology and the tools to allow for same-day registration, and even election day registration. And so I think that we need to move in that direction because the benefits in terms of voter participation outweigh the cost. Technology at this point makes it very feasible for us to have same-day registration.
The final topic I want to touch upon is the right to vote, which we all have, except in some states, convicted felons. North Carolina, a felon has to satisfy their probation and parole requirements, but this is an issue that the United States is kind of out there. A lot of the other democracies don't have these tight rules like we see in some states and even in North Carolina. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. In fact, there are 2 million people in the country, in the United States, who can't vote even though they've served their time, all their parole, all their probation. And it's a problem in places like Florida, Virginia, Kentucky. They're alone with Armenia as the only democracies in the world to disenfranchise everyone who has committed a felony for life, even after they've served their time. So there are certain bad actors, but even in states like North Carolina, where people are legally entitled to vote, there's a problem with essentially de facto disenfranchisement, where people have to jump over a variety of hoops to get their voting rights restored. And in order to enhance democracy, I think that there's a real value in eliminating bureaucratic barriers and ensuring that people who serve their time can cast a ballot no questions asked.